All right, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we have the city manager, Jesus Garza, who will be speaking to us in regards to his role and how he got into that profession. We ask that you mute all your phone lines, and if you do have any comments or questions that you'd like for him to address, please put it in our chat box. Thank you so much. You may begin.
Okay. If it's okay with you, this would be much better for me if I knew who was on the call specifically, because it would help me to know if the majority of the people that are on are students or counselors or parents, because that'll help me kind of how I relay the message.
Okay. If you all won't mind, if you either want to unmute yourself or put your who you are and your title within the message. Okay, Yesenia, she is a workforce outreach specialist. Are you able?
Lower Rio. That probably means Brownsville.
No, that's Cameron. Cameron would be
McAllen. There you go. I grew up in Brownsville, so I'll start. This is helpful, by the way. So thank you all for chiming in on who you are and who you're with. As was mentioned a few minutes ago, Jesus Garza, city manager in Victoria. I was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, down in the valley, and so I'm kind of been all over South Texas. After high school in Brownsville, I moved to San Antonio to go to school at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, where I not only did my undergrad, but did one of my graduate programs, which was a master's in public administration with a focus in urban management. And then eventually started my career in San Antonio and worked for the city manager in San Antonio, had an opportunity to be city manager in Kingsville, Texas, which I spent 3.5 years there. And here in Victoria, I've been here for a year now. All in all, I've been in local government in some shape or fashion at the city management level for about 10 years. And now my wife and I are super excited and happy to be in Victoria and hopefully going to be starting a family soon and setting some roots down. So I convey that to you because it's all related to my story. I'm very passionate about higher education. I'm very passionate about just education in general. One of my internships in college was interning for the Hispanic College Fund in Washington, D.C. And I was very interested in higher education. As a matter of fact, my first job after undergrad was serving as an admission counselor for St. Mary's University in San Antonio. And so I'm very familiar with just the importance of higher education, some of the challenges that some of our lower at-risk populations have to deal with, because I was very, very involved with that. And so any chance that I have to communicate to those groups or just in general talk about the profession, I enjoy doing that. I think that we need to pay it forward. There were a lot of people that helped me through my career that ensured that I have opportunities at an early age that I've taken advantage of. And so I think it's important that we pay it forward. So with that said, if you all ever have, any need, questions, you name it, I'm here as a resource. But in any case, so to take a little bit of a deeper dive, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the city management profession and sort of what that entails. But oftentimes the easiest way to explain it is that the city manager is similar to a CEO of a corporation. And as the CEO of the city here in Victoria, I'm responsible for about 630 employees. I'm administering a budget of about $140 million. And all in all, I report to the city council and the mayor, which in that analogy is similar to the board of directors for a for-profit company. And their role is to provide some general guidance, make sure that the train stays on the tracks, if you will. But ultimately, it's the CEO's or city manager's responsibility to administer the day-to-day. One of the biggest differences in city management versus some other I don't want to call it traditional CEO position, but city management is very diverse, and in some communities, more diverse than others. And so, for example, here in Victoria, we not only are responsible for some of the basic services that most cities provide: police, fire, public works, other infrastructure, but here we own and manage our own utility. And so here we run our water, wastewater system, and we also manage our own landfill. A lot of communities either have separate entities that provide water and wastewater, or have separate entities that provide garbage pickup. But in our community, we are what is referred to as a full service city. And so that makes it a little bit more complex, simply because of all the different facets that go into it. Oftentimes I'm asked, well, if you want to be a city manager, where do you need to start, or what do you need to get into? And the reality is that it's all over the place. I mean, you could literally study finance and work in the finance department for a city and work your way up. You could literally be an engineer, work in public works or engineering department, and move your way up. You can study HR, start in the HR department. My predecessor here actually started in HR, became HR director, and eventually became assistant city manager and then city manager. And so paths can be all over the place, and that's what makes city management a little bit different, in my opinion. But personally, for me, that path was centered around economic development. And so shortly after completing or while I was attending St. Mary's University for the master's in public administration and urban management, I was working for a nonprofit called Mexicans and Americans Thinking Together, which was headquartered in San Antonio with offices in Mexico City. And we were predominantly responsible for some economic development initiatives to assist at-risk populations in starting their own businesses and providing some support for them. Very similar to what over here maybe the SBDC does, which is a small business development center, but from a nonprofit, more at-risk targeted approach to clients in Mexico. Mexico in general, they're structured very differently. And so the nonprofit was aimed at assisting them with that effort, at least the part of the organization that I was involved with. One of the things that I think it's important to note is that for those that might be interested in a career in city management, is to be very, very specific and particular about which public administration program one pursues. And so oftentimes MPAs are generic in nature. Oftentimes people lose sight, even if you were talking about an MBA, sometimes people lose sight of the areas of focus that they include. And so most people don't realize that, MBA, you can get an MBA with a focus in finance, you can get an MBA with a focus in international business, or however you choose to do it. And with a master's in public administration, it's no different. You can go down the path of pursuing public policy, which is going to heavily focus on federal government, maybe even some state government. Now some MPA programs offer some specialties in nonprofit management. But my specific program at St. Mary's was urban management. And that's the key, is that you want to have students pursue graduate programs that are specific. Urban management, urban planning. Those are the ones that are really going to expose the students to the day-to-day of what it takes to run a city in the different facets. For example, the program at St. Mary's, all the professors were former city managers, former city attorneys. So that adds a higher level of experience, of exposure to the program, and that facilitated being able to literally go from graduating with that MPA in urban management to being a city administrator, which was my first gig in the city management world roughly 10 years ago, as the city administrator for Von Army, which is a very small city outside of San Antonio. Literally, it's 1.8 square miles, 1,200 people. I mean, the budget for the city was like $350,000. So very, very, very small. And because it was very, very small, you don't necessarily get a lot of perks, and it comes with sacrifices. And I think oftentimes, and one of the messages that I think it's important that we communicate is that, not everybody's going to be fortunate enough to, literally graduate and, you know, be extremely successful, right off the bat. Oftentimes people are motivated by money, and that's okay. But in this profession, you have to work your way up. And that can be done in one of two ways. You can start with one large organization and just work your way up, or you can be mobile and move around. And that's what I chose to do. Um, One of my internships during the graduate program was for the budget office for the city of San Antonio. And so after a couple years of being city administrator in Von Army, the gentleman who was the budget director and was my boss when I was an intern promoted up to be assistant city manager for the city of San Antonio and recruited me back to the city of San Antonio, where I worked there in the city manager's office for a little over 4 years, and arguably worked for the best city manager in the country. She's now retired. Her name is Cheryl Scully. But by all accounts, the best city manager in the country. And there are literally hundreds of people that are studying to be city managers that would apply to work under her organization, because she just was that type of leader. And now we joke that there's a Cheryl Scully tree of city managers because, as an example, the city manager of Dallas, city manager of Corpus Christi, myself, and there's a few others scattered around, all worked within her office in San Antonio, and over time have kind of gone on to do different things as city manager. And so I think that speaks volumes to the level of exposure that she gave us to what it takes to be a city manager. And she did that with us. But anyway, one of the things that I know is on my notes here is, what does your day-to-day look like when you're in the role? And of course, that depends on the size of the organization. When I was city administrator for the city of Von Army, I was literally the only full-time employee. And so I literally spent time doing everything. I mean, I think one time I remember having a stop sign in my trunk because I was the one that was going to replace a stop sign that had fallen down. And I was the one that was coordinating with the company we had hired to mow the right of way on the side of the street, which is quite my experience now is quite different. And because I'm in a bigger organization now, a lot of my time is spent collaborating with my team. And so, for example, I have two assistant city managers. Between the three of us, we split 16 different departments. And these department heads or directors, include folks that, you probably would recognize: police chief, fire chief, planning director, public works director, right? Those are kind of common. But there's, of course, a lot of administrative aspects of running a organization: IT director, HR director, finance director, and we do a slew of other things. And so between all three of us, it's a collaborative approach on managing the day-to-day. What I'm solely responsible for is that interaction with the elected officials. And so at the end of the day, the mayor, the city council members, they have their goals and objectives that they're trying to accomplish as elected officials. They have certain expectations of me, of the team. They have constituents that hold them accountable. And consequently, those constituents and the public drive a lot of what we do from a strategic planning and objective standpoint. And so my job, which is the hardest part, is to try and connect all the dots, right? And so it's very easy for people to show up to work and kind of just go about their business. But the hard part is trying to figure out, what are we doing today that ties into that objective, right? And so, for example, we're currently going through some conversations about how we can support small businesses, which we have never really done to the degree that we're proposing doing. And so naturally, people have a lot of questions about what we're trying to do because we've never done it. But the hard part is trying to connect how this initiative, regardless of it being new or not, directly ties into some of the objectives that we have outlined in the past. And so, for example, people ask me, well, why does a city want to get in the business of assisting small businesses? Well, that's one way to look at it, but we are in the business of having a thriving economy, right? We are in the business of doing what we can to secure job opportunities, right, for job retention. We are in the business of competing for new industry to come in, and whether we like it or not, we're in competition. And so, connecting those dots is one of the hardest things of the job, because it necessitates understanding both worlds. And there's the political world, which involves constituents, involves emotion, and you have the administrative side of the house, which is professionals, data driven, performance management, and you have to try and marry both. And so that's a big part of the job. And I would also venture to say that because of that, one of the biggest skill sets that is key to being a city manager in 2020 is the interpersonal skills and the emotional intelligence to be able to navigate those two worlds and be able to bounce back and forth in a moment's notice. It used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago that city managers were expected to just sit behind a desk and just kind of just run the operation, never show face. Nobody knew what they looked like. They were very behind the scenes. It was very, you all give the policy direction. I kind of just do what you want me to do. But over time, city management profession has evolved to being more diverse, more innovative, more involved, because the reality is that everything that we do has become more complex, and consequently, it's become more difficult for elected officials who don't do this full time, right? And while they may be very educated individuals, this isn't what they know, right? So, for instance, we have a mayor that's an architect. We've got a doctor. We've got an accountant. We have a business owner. Very, very intelligent people, but they don't know city government, right? They don't know urban planning. They don't know some of those things. And so, as city operations have become more complex, it necessitates a city manager that has more of an outgoing personality than what was the case 30, 40 years ago. Anyway, some of the things that I enjoy most about the job, quite frankly, is just the satisfaction of making a difference. I kind of went through this progression of, I always knew that I wanted to do government. And like most kids, and I would argue that this also happens to kids today, the only level of government that you're exposed to in movies, in the news, maybe even by your own parents or other influencers, is at the national level, right? All you see in movies is stuff related to the president. All you hear about, maybe from parents if they vote, is maybe voting for president, governor. And so as a kid growing up in that environment of only being exposed to national type of government, I didn't really realize what local government did. And growing up in a typical Mexican family on the border, my family's understanding of local government was more based on the Mexican model as opposed to US model. And so my idea of local government growing up was just not a good one. And so I mentioned earlier that I did an internship with Hispanic College Fund in DC. That was because I spent some time at American University, because I wanted to see what life in DC was like. Long story short, didn't like it. Too far removed from making a difference. Came back to Texas, and slowly but surely worked my way down to local government. And I think one of the things that I enjoy about local government is that I typically tell people that I'm in the business of making things happen and not in the business of making it seem like things are happening. And oftentimes at the federal and state level, because you're so far removed, it's very, very hard to actually make things happen. And so I get the satisfaction for making things happen at the local level. Um, some of the things related to COVID-19, that was one of the questions on my list. We had to adjust, obviously, what we do to a certain extent, but we also don't have the luxury of completely shutting down, right? We offer essential services, police, fire. Um, if your house starts burning down and you call 911, we can't say, sorry, firefighters are working from home, they can't come out. And so we needed to find ways to do that. The same thing with the police department. And quite frankly, even on the infrastructure side, right? People generally take for granted, water coming out of the faucet, water going down the toilet when they flush it. But those are all things that necessitate keeping an eye on the piping system and everything else. And so if some of that stuff breaks down, our crews need to be able to go and fix that. And so we can't just not be around. People's trash still needs to be picked up, right? And so one of the biggest messages that I tried to communicate to our employees throughout this whole COVID-19 process was we need to make it seem in the eye of our resident or customer that nothing's changed, right? And we need to be as reliable as possible. And so if somebody's trash is supposed to be picked up every Monday, we need to make sure that their trash gets picked up every Monday. Because as many uncertainties as there are right now with COVID-19, I wanted to make sure that the city wasn't contributing to some of that uncertainty. And we also were able to make some minor adjustments to help facilitate maybe some stress from some of our residents. And so, for example, because of a lot of people losing their jobs, we're still kind of facilitating payment plans, waiving of late fees and things of that sort with people paying their water bill, as an example. Very minor, but our goal with that exercise was to try and at least be flexible with our residents and be understanding that, they might not be able to pay their bill this month. And maybe they might do it over time through a payment plan, but we shouldn't penalize them for, losing their job because of this pandemic that nobody had anything to do with. And so ultimately, we're beginning to go back to a new normal, continuing to offer services online. And I think one of the lessons learned that I think a lot of organizations are learning through this COVID-19 pandemic is that you can accomplish quite a bit through technology. And I think some of the telecommuting practices and a few other things, might be here to stay, right? I mean, clearly I've had people that, were coming in 8 to 5 that clearly can produce if they work from home, right? And so we're exploring opportunities to develop programs that might have some options for our employees that can work from home, working from home during certain times out of the month or week, and just be kind of more flexible with that. One of the things that I'm very conscious of is that we live in different times. And if you all are into leadership or management, I would encourage you to Google VUCA world, VUCA. But a VUCA world is one that is very volatile, uncertain, complicated, right? And the reality is that complex, and the reality is that we live in a VUCA world now. And if you think about the structures that we all operate under, these are structures that have been existing for 100 years, right? I mean, this whole concept of working 8 to 5, how long has that been around? And so oftentimes people are doing things just because it's the way they've always done them and not really asking themselves, is this effective? Is this productive? And as a 21st century leader, as I try and call myself, I'm very conscious of those things. And COVID-19 is creating an opportunity for us to have those conversations. But anyway, I do not have any props. The sheet says to show props. The only prop I have is that I was in the middle of writing birthday cards. And so if you're into leadership, I would encourage you to take a moment and sign birthday cards for your employees and never forget that it's because of them that we do what we do. This is my only prop that I happen to have on my desk. So anyway, with that, I'm happy to take any questions. This is kind of a little bit different, right? Not being able to see y'all's faces, uh, and maybe you're falling asleep. I have no idea. Um, so, okay, I think I saw a question come through. What is one of the most interesting projects or opportunity you have worked on? Um, I think here in Victoria, I think the one that we're working on right now, I've only been here for a little less than a year. Next week is my 1 year anniversary. And part of um, part of the reasoning for um, coming to Victoria was to try and bring fresh perspective. And so, for example, I'm the first city manager to come from the outside in almost 40 years. Um, Council was at a point where they wanted to bring somebody um, from the outside to offer fresh perspective. And so, with that in mind, the last year has been full of assessing, making observations. And so, the specific program that I mentioned earlier to support small businesses um, is not something the city had ever done before. And so, it's the most interesting because in the first time in almost a year that I've been here, it's probably the biggest initiative that I'm involved with that is new and different, and is causing a lot of conversation. And so that's intriguing. Um, how much money do you make? That's a great question. City managers are very fortunate. Um, you know, city managers um, definitely make six figures in cities that are of reputable size. I mean, I can tell you that being city manager in Kingsville, which is smaller than Victoria, I was already in the six-figure mark when I was in Kingsville, and so that continued and was increased when I came to Victoria because of it being a larger organization. I think there's a misconception that because one is in public service, that there you are not properly compensated in public service, and I would argue that that's not accurate. Um, and I think over the last 2 decades, there's been a push for governments to be more competitive because organizations are competing for talent because people are beginning to realize that in order to be effective, it takes a very, very particular set of skills and skills that are transferable. And so now cities are competing with talent from all across sectors. And it didn't used to be that way 30, 40 years ago. And you also, specifically in this profession of city management, you have a lot of baby boomers that are retiring. And unfortunately, the profession, and they admit to it with the professional association that I'm involved with, have not done a really good job of being inclusive. My first city management association conference was, I think, 2009. And I walked in and I was the youngest person in the room and the only Hispanic. And it was just a bunch of old white men. And unfortunately, what that has led to is that in the last 5 to 7 years, as individuals have retired, people are beginning to realize there really wasn't a good job of preparing this next generation of leaders. And so there's generation skip. And so if you think of who city managers out there, it's people that are above 55 or mid 30s. There's like a whole generation there skipped of people preparing for city managers. And so, for instance, I know somebody mentioned that they're in McAllen, but like Noel, who's a city manager in Brownsville, him and I are the same age. We're in our mid 30s, and uh, he's a city manager for a city much larger than Victoria. And that's just kind of the way that it's gone. Um, how would you tell a high school student who was interested in public service their first debate? Um, I would encourage a high school student to definitely simply get involved with whatever civic organization. I think volunteering, I think helps. I think it exposes you to different realities um, of how other people might be living. Some of the volunteer efforts that I participated in high school exposed me to certain things that otherwise I had not been exposed to. And some of those were very eye opening. And so I think that's very helpful. I think any extracurricular activity I think is critical. Um, Again, we live in a day and age where the skills that are more and more leading to people being successful go above and beyond simply just having a degree or having a specific skill set. It's the being able to manage conflict. It's being able to have objectives and sticking and be reliable and sticking to them. Team player, right? And these are things that are learned oftentimes through extracurricular activities, sports, debate, I mean, whatever it is. Um, and so I think all of that I think helps. Um, where do you want to go from here? Do you plan on staying in Victoria? Absolutely. So I'm I definitely want to stay in Victoria. I think my goal is 10 years, and I haven't been shy about that. Um, that's a stretch, quite frankly. Uh, the shelf life of a city manager is roughly only 3 or 4 years. Um, that also didn't used to be the case, but as the city management profession has evolved into being one of being more involved, that creates for a quicker um, shelf life. But my wife and I are at the beginning stages of starting a family, and so we definitely want to establish a home base. 10 years would put me past the 20 years that I need to have in the Texas municipal retirement system to have the option of starting retirement. Of course, I'd be too young at the time when I get there, but that would create opportunities for me to maybe do something different or something more. Um, I live and breathe public service, and there are a lot of ways in which one can contribute outside of city management. And so I envision myself after 10 years from now doing something completely different. Um, are there post-secondary degree programs specific to becoming city manager? If so, do you know schools that offer that? Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned St. Mary's University, the program that I went through. That was a master's in public administration and urban management, which is very specific to local government, that had former city managers, former city attorneys being the professors in the program. I also have a graduate degree from UTSA in urban and regional planning. Those are helpful for people that want to get a sense of how cities grow and the different intricacies. Um, it doesn't happen by magic, and there's a whole science behind it. And there's a reason why some cities became successful over time and grew, and others didn't. And so, being familiar with which types of investments contributed to that, or what held back a certain community, and things of that sort, really help you kind of understand the big picture. Um, let's see here. I mentioned your passion for education. Do you have a vision to promote education? It's a pretty broad question. Internally with my employees, absolutely. I think education / professional development, I think, is the key to just always being on top of what's best practice and being challenged and being motivated. And so I'm pretty big on pushing that. In terms of how I personally do it outside of work, I mentioned earlier about a passion for at-risk youth. And so, for example, I'm on the board for the Boys and Girls Club here in Victoria. And I've been involved with Boys and Girls Club since I was in Kingsville. I was on the board there. When I was in San Antonio, I was on the board, not for Boys and Girls Club, but for a very similar um, organization called Hoven. And I've been a big brother for, let's see, Fabian's been my little brother through the Big Brother, Big Sister program. When he was in 7th grade, we started, and he's now about to turn 21 or 20. So I try and do what I can. Happy to go to high school or wherever to speak. Happy to do that. We need more good people in this business. Any other questions? Let's see. Oops. I don't see any other questions coming through. Raquel, I don't know how you want to proceed.
No, I'm waiting for you. If you all don't have any other questions and you think of something that you'd like to address at a later date and time, please feel free to email me or contact me and I'll relay them to Jesus. And I appreciate you all for logging in. Thank you, Jesus, for your time. And
yeah, absolutely.
You all stay safe, stay healthy. And once again, thank you everyone for connecting in.